My name is A'Jamal Byndon. I'm the co-host of Special Edition, and we're going to talk about immigration. Also with me is Dr. Pat Velasquez and also Dr. Benjamin Prado. I may have mispronounced his name, but they're both in San Diego and scholars and dealt with many issues. We decided that Ben could join us because he's definitely involved in border issues. And one of the things that we do is we also give our guests a chance to kind of give a bit of introduction. But I know he's a professor. He deals with a number of academic issues, but he's also a person who works directly with the people in the community. And I know that he's been involved in immigration issues for years and so on. And that's a little bit background on that. Pat, would you say, Dr. Vasquez, can you say a little bit about yourself?
Well, I was born and raised in Omaha, Nebraska. My grandparents immigrated to Omaha from central Mexico in the early 1900s. My family were some of the first Mexicans in South Omaha and lived there for over 30 years and moved to San Diego, California about 35 years ago. And so I was a professor and administrator at UC San Diego. Um, And it was there that I met Ben. Ben was an undergraduate student at UCSD at the time, and he was involved with some very progressive activist organizations. So we got to know each other, and I would say even at the time that I think we were both at UC San Diego, there was a lot of interest in immigration issues, but also a lot of outright right-wing repressive movements. And I think Ben, you and I were both there during the era of Proposition 187 that tried to make immigration without authorization a state crime and was later ruled unconstitutional. But that was just a symptom of some of the xenophobia and racism against migrant peoples that had been going on long before that, but certainly was at a high point then. And so we thought it'd be good to revisit the issue now.
Good. Well, let me start our whole process by Ben, if you could tell a little bit more background on yourself and your experience with migrants in the U.S.-Mexican border.
Absolutely. Number one, thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this program. I do have to clarify, I'm not a doctor, right? I don't have those credentials. I did my understudy work, undergraduate at UCSD, as Patrick laid out. I was a student in political science then, and I participated in and got very involved with the student newspaper Voz Fronteriza and participated in the Raza Rights Coalition. Joined very early on Unión del Barrio, my political home, if you will, where I was formed politically, ideologically on this question. Really, what we're dealing with is the question of settler colonialism. And got hired on at the U.S.-Mexico Border Program, a program of the American Friends Service Committee. And for 20 years now, I've been actively engaged and involved in the defense of the human, democratic, and civil rights of migrants and their families, migrant workers in particular, right? And we say migrants because we understand that this whole question of migration, right? Some people use the term immigration. We see that the majority of the people, specifically in the Southwest, are not immigrants, right? But in fact, indigenous peoples from this whole continent, right? And political borders that have been drawn up as a consequence of settler colonialism, invasion, war, and occupation really is a fundamental problem to the issue and the question of U.S. immigration policy. And so, I have been working on this issue for 20 years. Everything from what really got me involved is my own family experience of having to cross borders and deal with the harassment and the checkpoints, and then really living here in San Diego during 1990s, right? When, as Patrick laid out, there was a lot of policies that were being implemented at the statewide level. That's really, I am a product, if you will, of the 1994 Proposition 187 generation that had to deal with this issue of slander, number one, calling us, illegal aliens, illegal criminal aliens, using all these adjectives in order to really attack working class Mexicans primarily, right? Into subjecting us and creating this whole kind of psychological warfare, trying to label us as if we're somehow foreign to this geographic area known as the U.S. Southwest, when in fact, it was the United States that invaded us, right? That imposed this political border. So, you know, the everything from the beatings that came down against migrants in 1996, this very one particular incident that really, you know, captured my attention was a brutal beating of Mexicans on the side of the road by Border Patrol. And then ever since then, you know, seeing how Border Patrol is really a standing army that functions in the interest of capitalism for all intents and purposes, hunting down.
Ben, just a
Yeah.
second. Ben, I don't even, we got a lot of questions. I know you got a long-winded answer there, but we want to kind of do it back and forth a little bit.
Oh,
And
okay,
also,
okay, yeah, no worries.
one question, one thing came to mind. Use the word migrant versus immigrant, and you said something like migrant is different than immigrant. And I don't know if people know the difference of the symbolism of that word. Just give me briefly, why do you use those terms differently? Because people don't understand that sometimes.
Yeah, you know, as you know, as humanity, right? We're about 250,000 years old as a species, right? And our species has migrated since time immemorial. We move from place to place, right? Eventually establishing civilization with agriculture and the development of civilization, right? But in the 250,000 years that we've existed, we've always migrated. We've always moved from
So
one
how does
place
that
to
differ
another.
from immigrant? That's what I'm trying to get.
Immigrant is more of the political policies, right? It's the policies that are implemented by the modern nation state, if you will.
Gotcha.
Right?
That
So
makes sense. Okay, I was unclear.
and it's
Okay,
mainly
gotcha.
used in the United States as immigrants. Every other place around the world kind of uses migrants or
Okay, got you. That makes sense. Thank you.
yeah. And that is important because, you know, when we talk about U.S. immigration policy, right, as it's known, it's divided into those that are authorized to be here and enter, right, and who provides that authorization, and not only just the authorization to be here, but also the other fundamental characteristic of our species, which is our ability to work and reproduce our existence through our labor, right? It's, you know, you have the authorized worker and then the unauthorized worker, which is a relatively new phenomena as a consequence of a 1986 neoliberal policies implemented by the Reagan administration to criminalize labor, criminalize workers, right? Even though there's been different policies throughout the entire history of the United States, everything from slavery, for example, who, you know, they had full rights and full employment as, you know, people who were brought here forcefully to work, right? And then on the other hand, you have now in the more, you know, so-called modern era, the same policies of captured labor, right, or labor that is considered illegal, right, in the political sense, in the formal colonial sense of U.S. immigration policy, that then subjects those that are not authorized into some terrible conditions of not being able to get paid, for example, for the work that we do. So, you know, those are important distinctions because it you know, two important things of migrating and work have been, you know, codified in these colonial policies that today forms U.S. immigration policy. And I could keep going, but you know, I want to.
Well, yeah, we got time constraints, bro. So we got to be careful there.
Sounds good.
Let me jump in here. Ben, I've lived in San Diego, as I said, for about 35 years now, and I'm glad you mentioned the fact about the checkpoints in the border areas like San Diego. And I think for somebody like myself that grew up far from the border in Omaha, Nebraska, this is something that the Chicano community in Omaha can think about. Man, it was a real shock for me the first time I'm going down the freeway and I see there's some border checkpoint that's probably about 50, 60 miles away from the border. And you're forced to pull over. The immigration agent comes and looks you in the face. And if you look quote unquote suspicious, you have to pull over and they can ask you whatever questions they want. So it's the kind of thing that we hear about you know, Israeli police doing to Palestinians. And it was a real shock for me the first time I went through that process. So during the whole time that I've lived in San Diego, there's always been, again, some kind of story or focus on migrants at the border. But I wanted to ask you, Ben, what kind of things have you seen in more recent years, maybe since the Trump administration started? What's really changed in the border dynamic, and is there any difference in the various nationalities that we see trying to cross the border?
Yeah, I think one of the, it's really difficult just to kind of focus since Trump, right? There has been a, I don't want to call it an evolution, a real, degeneration, if you will, of how immigration policy is implemented since the 90s, actually. Since 1994, when Operation Gatekeeper was actually implemented by the Clinton administration, because it was that moment that we saw a lot of shifts of migrant workers, mainly from Mexico, who had used to cross in a circular fashion. They would, it was labor that would come to the United States, work for a couple months, and then go back, right? And since 1994, before 1994, there was an estimated 3 million people in not unauthorized status here in the United States, and that would be circular. 1994 comes, they put up these walls in the major urban areas, whether it be in California, Arizona, Nuevo Mexico, and Texas, that pushes migration into the mountains and deserts, right? And so we see a policy of death, people dying. 2001, another important period, because right after 9/11, the implementation and restructuring of immigration policy within the Department of Homeland Security was codified, was consolidated. And in that instance, it was the George Bush administration that then, labeled from being just criminal, illegal aliens to now, potential terrorists, right? And so the Department of Homeland Security and the creation of Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Fast forward to, Barack Obama, man, he deported more migrants than any other president in the history of this country combined. Even Trump, right? Because he had 2 terms to do it. And he really consolidated this whole mechanism of identifying, detaining, deporting migrants. It was consolidated under the Obama administration. The Trump administration came in with this, pretty well-oiled machine and said, let's go after everyone, right? So we started seeing, people being picked up in front of their homes, on their way to work, while they're at work, right? These massive work site raids, and really implementing the weight of this colonial policy. Now, since Trump, in the current administration, we see that because of the pandemic, there are many more people coming to the border that are not, just, migrant workers, crossing the border, right? Like we had before Trump, meaning that now we have all kinds of different nationalities showing up, here at the border, literally, going over these walls that you see in my background and being stuck in between them, and every nationality that you can think of. One of the things that we've always said, and we look, is that you can't expect people to have to live through this constant wars that the United States has unleashed ever since time immemorial, really, but in the recent history, since 9/11, since the so-called war of terror of the Bush administration, Obama's ongoing war, and over whether it be in Libya or even Central America, right? We see coups, we see literally invasions, I mean, bombs being dropped on people, and not expect that those people are not going to move, or not going to migrate. And that's what we see here at the border today. Everybody escaping not only war, but also climate phenomena, climate change. We also see people, really leaving the conditions of a post pandemic or post COVID world economy, where everybody's, economic situation has shifted, has changed. And so now they're trying to find, work in a neoliberal economic order. And that's really important and key for us to really kind of hone in on, right? Is like there's a certain distinction, certain economic characteristic that forms the world economy, that, not only is it because of the localized economic situation, but it's a global economy. And the United States and the global economy responds to certain extractive mechanisms, whether it be, loans, the IMF, the World Bank,
Let me interrupt you again. The question also asks, what kind of immigrants are coming into the United States? You work close with the border, but you mentioned in a generic sense. I'm saying, what nationalities? Can you say they come from all over the world? But what's different today in these recent years versus, let's say, 20 or 30 years ago in terms of the nationality? What specific groups or countries do you see coming in at the border?
So the majority of the people that used to be coming in were Mexican migrant labor, Mexican and Central American. Now we see people from all over the world, and we're talking about today, for example, it was about 40 Ecuadorians, right? We've seen, people from, Afghanistan, from Georgia, from
You mean
Turkey.
Georgia in the south or Georgia in
No,
Russia?
Georgia in kind of like Asia area,
Oh,
right?
okay. I'm like, what?
Eurasia
Okay,
area,
help me.
right?
Thank you.
Middle East
Okay.
area. Yeah. From Korea.
So Asians are
Far East
coming in
Africa.
also with other
Asians,
national.
yeah.
Okay, that's what I was
India,
trying to get to.
India, right? So we see every nationality really
Okay,
represented at the border seeking asylum, which is distinct from the kind of migration patterns that we've seen historically in terms of migrant labor, primarily
okay,
from Mexico, Central America. Every now you'll see people from South America. But we also see the consequences of economic blockades, for example, Cubans, Venezuelans, Nicaraguans, right? Because there's certain differentiated treatment towards people who would want to, migrate or seek refugee status, right? Because it's differentiated treatment. Especially if you oppose, the governments of those countries, right? So there's a lot of different nationalities, and the adjustment, even the United States has not even really accounted for that shift post-Trump, post-COVID.
gotcha. You know what's surprising and most people don't know is I want to emphasize something you said earlier. You said there were more people deported under an African American president like Obama than even some of these other ones, but he codified a system that these other presidents follow through. So that's a big surprise for some people who thought you would have much more liberal Democratic who would be much more open to the borders of people coming in as asylees or other issues. I'm going to switch up because I know we're chasing time. Can you describe a phenomenon of migrants applying for asylum? Because some people don't know what that word means versus migrating for economic reasons, but asylum is compared to Mexicans who are trying to evade capture by ICE. Also, what is the change in the so-called remaining policy for asylum seekers? Again, if you could deconstruct those concepts, because a lot of our lay people who are new to immigration don't understand some of those concepts.
Yeah, absolutely. So, when most migration to the United States has historically just been like in undocumented migrant workers, right? Or even, migrants that applied for H-2A, H-2B visas, which are work visas, right?
Okay.
People apply for them, and there's a certain number of them, and so they usually they're exhausted by the first, second day. As soon as they open, there's kind of like this lottery system, and people in certain countries can apply for them. They get them, and they enter, whether it be through that formal, so-called legal channel, or people, whether evade border patrol and are able to come into the United States, right? And there's a lot of employment to be, in different sectors of the U.S. economy. So it's mainly that migrant labor that was coming in. Recently, right, in the recent history, we're talking about last 6 years, and there has been a shift to a lot more asylees, right? People who are escaping, whether it be the poverty in their own country, the persecution, a lot of repressiveness in whatever country they're from, or even climate change, right? Because climate phenomena have impacted people's ability even to live in their own country. So certain emergency declarations that have been, and so there's a different international agreements that the United States is signatory to that allow people to show up to the ports of entry, a formal port of entry, whether it be a land port, in this case San Isidro port of entry in California, or whatever port of entry along the southern border, or also, airports, another port of entry. But most people, because they don't have that authorization to come in through a port of entry, say through an airport or through a land port, they show up at in this case, the Mexican ports of entry, Mexican or U.S. ports of entry along the southern border. Now, the United States has created a policy where they stop people who do not have already a valid visa to enter. And so they pretty much a blockade, if you will, people's ability to present themselves legally at a port of entry if they're seeking asylum. Trump implemented what is known as Title 42, a policy that would not only prohibit people from seeking asylum, but then they implemented a Remain in Mexico policy, which says that if you didn't have a valid visa, you would have to wait in Mexico to get a permission to come and seek asylum and stay in Mexico until your asylum case is brought up in court.
Now, Ben, hold on real quick. This is something people don't understand. So if you got to stay in Mexico and you're there, who helps pays for those folks who can't get across the border? In other words, it's one thing when you get to the United States and you're here and you're low income and poor. When they make them stay in Mexico, who picks up the cost from these people from other countries? And we're not talking necessarily about Mexican nationals. We're talking from all people all over the world. They're forced to stay there. What happens there? In other words, does the government subsidize, meaning the U.S. government subsidize the Mexican government or whoever, so these people can eat and have basic necessities?
No, absolutely not. So it's not even the U.S. They do not provide any type of economic aid for those purposes of helping feed, clothe, and house people. What they do is provide economic military support to the Mexican government to enforce U.S. immigration law. So the externalization, if you will, of U.S. immigration policy is now being externalized to other countries. Mexico, unfortunately, has the terrible job now of enforcing U.S. immigration policy
In their own country.
In their own country, yeah.
Wow.
And so, what we see is that migrants, and sometimes it's, we'll see that Mexican officials provide, this kind of temporary status so that people can stay there. They even provide them a little card, identification card. Many people get employed in Mexico and work in Mexico. You can go to any kind of border state in Mexico today and see many different nationalities working, whether it be on the streets, whether it be in certain businesses. There's even in Tijuana is a place called Little Haiti, where a whole colonia, right, a whole kind of community of Haitians have kind of established themselves there, right? And that's just a phenomena of many people coming through Mexico, and some people even stay, right? They say, "Wow, I'd rather establish myself there in Mexico." The problem is that there's this whole economy around that was created as a consequence of building these border walls, these border barriers. A whole economy around human smuggling has emerged. Many of them led by even U.S. authorities. There were border patrol agents who say, "Don't come, don't cross drugs, don't cross people," and they were the ones involved in this activity. In fact, the border czar Alan Burson one time said that the biggest issue that they've had is that border agents are involved in these networks of human smuggling, letting cars come through the border. So this issue of human smuggling comes and is fabricated, is created. It's a whole economy that is created as a consequence of these building border walls. Before 1993, when somebody had to just whether go around a chain link fence or there was no fence at all, small little families would say, "Yeah, okay, here, I'll guide you across." They would be considered guides, right? $300 only for the first time, because by that time you already know how to kind of get around. Nowadays it's a whole economy, and it's a whole this huge giant infrastructure that organized crime has built as a way to extract money and resources from migrants themselves, right? So this whole economy that emerged as a result of building border walls and making it more difficult to cross.
Well, that was a question I wanted to ask you too, Ben. Was I saw a report on the media where they talked to a Chinese migrant, and he was there at the Mexican border getting ready to cross to the United States, and he told the reporter that he had paid something like $10,000 to get from China to the United States Mexico border, and then he had people already in the United States ready to pick him up and give him a sponsorship and a place to stay. And this struck me as so different than most of the experiences of Mexicano migrants that come across the border with almost nothing in their pocket. So I don't know how widespread this is, but have you in your work seen migrants coming across that seem like they have a lot more resources than what we're typically seeing among migrants?
Yeah, absolutely. And it depends on which country, right? Because there's people that come in, you could tell they are very well off, right? I mean, some of the clothes that they wear and all these other things, right? They're not expecting what the border crossing actually is, right? What it looks like, what it feels like, right? So they're kind of like a little in shock. But, it really depends on different countries. 10,000 for Chinese nationals, that's kind of like on the lower end, and in terms of how much people pay much more than that, right? The going rate, that even Mexicanos have paid, and 10,000 is like going through a port of entry, and meaning that there's an agent there that's going to wave you by, right? I mean that does exist, right? And so we have seen and heard of working class Mexicanos who actually pay that much just to cross into the United States. The other nationalities, yeah, there's a huge network, everything from their home country to the border, right? These if you will, informal tourist, human trafficking, human smuggling type of networks, right? It's there's an economy around it, right? I think the critical piece here is that when you militarize the border, when you make it much more difficult, you create and you fabricate, you manufacture, if you will, that type of economy. Most people, U.S. and in the United States, can, with their own passport, jump on a plane tomorrow, book themselves a ticket to whatever country, and usually they'll be allowed in. But that's where you see the differentiated treatment between how the United States treats other people coming in and wanting to come, and whether it be visit or reunite with family members or even work, right? So that's also key to understand the differentiated and very unequal relationship that the United States shares with the rest of the world. Now the question is why, right? And part of the answer as to why that exists is because the United States is an empire, and we have to recognize that we live within an economic empire that extracts the world's natural resources and impoverishes many countries around the world, and through either hook or crook, right? Meaning either they do it through coercive measures that they have set up, whether it be the Organization of American States or other, international entities to implement U.S. policy. So an immigration policy responds to U.S. Foreign policy, or they do it through invasion, war, and occupation. And that's why we see many people leaving their home countries to try to come here, because this is where all the resources end up. It's no surprise that the United States is the richest country in the world, because it's stealing all the resources from the people around the world through war, through invasion, through occupation, through economic coercion, and through military coups, right? And I think those are important key components to understand why is it that U.S. immigration policy on the one hand says, no, you Mexicans, Central Americans, Latin Americans, or Haitians or Africans cannot come to the United States. You have to, jump through all these border walls and all that other stuff. But yet, Ukrainians, for example, get the red carpet rolled out when it's in the interest of the United States. They say, hey, well, Ukrainians, come on in, or certain Cubans, you come on in. Certain Nicaraguans and Venezuelans, you all come on in, because it benefits our economic interest and our political objectives, right? And I'm not saying mine, because I'm talking about the U.S. empires, right?
Yeah. I one of the things that come to mind is I heard the story, and I know about there's 29 Mexican immigrants who died crossing at the border in 2023. We heard of a young Latino who drowned right across the border, and a 61-year-old African who also died. And I know years ago I saw that picture of the Mexican national and his daughter they died drowned. It was sent shockwaves throughout the world community of these people trying to come in, and they drown, and we really create such a horrific policy and so on. So my question is that simply crossing that border more dangerous now? And what are the factors that affect the safety of the immigrants from your perspective and someone who works very close with many of these folks who are coming over or trying to come over? Let's put it that way.
Yeah, there's no doubt in my mind that the current U.S. border policy is a policy of death. It's a policy of calculated death. It was conceived under the Department of Defense, meaning the Pentagon. That's where it was designed in terms of like, okay, how
wait, hold it.
create-
You lost me. You're saying the Pentagon instead of the Department of Home, the other departments that deal with homeland issues and folks who are much more humane. You got a military department determining our immigration policy? I don't understand that.
Absolutely. You have it was the Department of Defense was the one who built that border wall. In other words, the Army Corps of Engineers. It was designed by the Army Corps of Engineers of how to set up these border walls to kind of push people out into the mountains and deserts. And if you look at the policy of building border walls today, it's been privatized. So now it's no longer the Department of Defense, but you have contractors like Hewitt Corporation, there's several other private entities, Boeing, Northrop Grumman, all these different entities that build this and design these border walls with the objective of making them much more deadly. That's where the whole deterrence concept and strategy, the strategy of deterrence was implemented by the United States to supposedly make it much more difficult, much more deadly, so that people would say, "Oh wow, I'm not gonna risk my life and try to cross." But since day one, since these policies were implemented to start building border walls, we saw deaths, migrants dying in the mountains, deserts, and today it's much more deadlier because the border walls, number one, are much higher, much taller. We have pictures here to compare. You can see it.
By the way, I saw some barbed wire, the kind you use in prisons, on the wall.
yeah.
And I thought I heard some news or something where the Texas governor wanted to put more barbed wires where people can get hurt and killed trying to climb the wall. I'm talking about barbed wires that can hurt you seriously.
And it's not only barbed wire, right? We have these buoys, and in between the buoys.
What's a buoy?
A buoy, those things that float on water.
Oh, okay.
Okay, and so there's these designed buoys out in the Rio Grande, which I understand have been the Abbott administration the governor was forced to allow federal agents to remove. But in between these buoys, there was a saw. So if somebody was
hold it. You're saying a saw that cuts people or wood. You said in the water.
That's right.
Oh man.
It was in between these buoys, a saw, an actual saw that turns, that has teeth, that is meant to kill, to cause horrendous harm, death, and people have been dying. People, it's not a new phenomena. It's very much ingrained as part of U.S. border policy to make it that much more deadlier. The size of the wall, in fact. This Trump wall that you see behind me in my image here, I'm not sure if you can see it, but that wall is 30 feet high, and it was created 30 feet high because at 30 feet people begin to lose their focus, their orientation, they lose their balance, and they can easily fall. And so what we've been seeing, in fact, there was a mass casualty incident here in San Diego. About 10 people fell from the wall in one attempt, right? So there was people who were climbing, who were moving, and 10 people fell, right? And so it is meant to cause these terrible horrendous falls, people dying. It is very much calculated death. We know, and U.S. officials know that if people continue to attempt to cross, many will die,
Wow.
and it's part of the equation.
Ben, we're getting into the area that we really wanted to talk about too, or at least another area, and that's the actual policy about the border. And one thing A'Jamal and I had talked about before was, as we know, we have a very racist governor of Texas, Greg Abbott, and he worked with the state legislature in Texas to pass state laws that effectively allow Texas to implement its own immigration policy. And I understand that one federal court has halted that law for now, but it's probably going to end up before the United States Supreme Court. What's your analysis of this kind of attempt by state governments to usurp federal immigration law?
Yeah, I mean, like you mentioned at the beginning of the program, California led that effort through Proposition 187. Its attempt to create U.S. immigration policy within the state to make every healthcare worker, every educator, every health and human services provider an immigration agent, right? That was the objective of Proposition 187, so that not only undocumented families or people, but also their children could not qualify or receive any type of social or economic support. And that was challenged and eventually was overturned. But these states are doing the exact same thing, so it's not new. It's an attempt of states to exert their so-called authority to supposedly do what the federal government, has not done, which is to continue a rhetoric of, criminalizing migrant workers, right? It's a political ploy, first and foremost, right? And it's really much led by a white nationalist, anti, I want to even say migrant, but it's the. I don't like to use the word nativist because there's nothing native about these policies that it's a white nationalist policy, right? So it's a very xenophobic, very much targeted towards migrant workers, migrant labor. And just real quick, today the Supreme Court actually overturned I want to say SB 4 down in Texas, right? So that policy is being halted as of today, and so we'll see, how it plays out, when in as well as in Florida, right? There's other policies there that are being implemented, but for all intents and purposes, they're political. They're expressions of white nationalism veiled in state autonomy to protect so-called, U.S. citizens. But it is very much a white nationalist effort because it does make that distinction, right? It discriminates against other people, other nationalities, with the express objective of for all intents and purposes, trying to capture, right? They're capturing, they're detaining, and they're creating, and they're feeding into this giant, massive business of detaining migrants. And that in itself is another economy, right? We have CoreCivic, Geo Corporation, before it was called Wackenhut, changed its name to Corrections Corporation of America, and now it's CoreCivic. So it's private entities who are passing these legislative bills in order to be able to build more prisons, be able to build more, get more resources from the state in order to feed their own economic interests. And so these are very much private companies who are promoting these policies so that they can capture more people and warehouse them in these concentration camps known as detention centers.
A question comes up as recent President Biden embraced a right-wing policy that was approved by the U.S. Senate but stalled in the House of Representatives The policy would close the border to asylum seekers and others and allow the president to grant humanitarian paroles to migrants from favorite countries, quote, favorite countries like Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. In other words, those countries that he may not like in a sense, and allow white Europeans, migrants to enter the U.S. How much are the two political parties both in favor of immigration policies that reflects this white supremacy as controlled contrast to what we're supposed to be doing?
I mean, as it relates to immigration policy, they are both one and the same. They just posture as different policies. And there's so much political posturing. A Democrat or a Republican on the issue of immigration, there's really no difference. There may be a difference, a tactical difference, if you will, right? But the objectives have always been the same: criminalize migrant labor, militarize the border, make economic policies that favor U.S. investment and corporations versus workers in their home country. And one thing that we say, people have a right not to migrate, right? People have a right to say, no, I want to stay in my own country. Why do they, identify Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela? Is because they have a different economic system that they're operating under, right? They believe in socialism. They believe in creating an economy for that creates as much relative equality for everyone to have access to healthcare, housing, education that is not monetized like it is here in the United States, like it's not privatized like it is here in the United States. And so they identify these because there's an ongoing war, an economic war, a financial war, even a information war, right? About how United States people in the United States perceive these countries, right? Cuba, for all intents and purposes, has been blockaded economically for 60 years, and its economy cannot develop naturally like any other country would because it has to use the U.S. operated and controlled SWIFT system, which is a banking system that moves money internationally. And so Cuba has been blockaded for more than 60 years, and yet they're determined to continue with self-determination and build their economy according to how they see fit. That's the essence of self-determination, right? But the United States wants to contain and maintain an ongoing war against them. In Venezuela, the United States stole basically, the U.S. The Venezuelan-run oil company known as Citgo here in the United States. Literally a entire refining infrastructure, which Venezuela is a huge possessor of the largest reserves of oil known in the entire world. There's a reason why the United States wants to overturn the current government in Venezuela, because it wants to capture those economic resources, right? Those natural resources. Nicaragua has, they have a blockade, this NICA Act, that makes it, that sanctions all these different countries, that sanctions certain companies that go and want to make and have business in with Nicaragua. So economic sanctions, economic, commercial, and financial blockades form this kind of war against those three specific countries because they believe in socialism and not capitalism, right? And so that's how we see and it's favored, it's not favored in favor of those countries, but in favor of those that oppose those regimes, if you will, right? And so that's the distinction that has to be made. In fact, Nicaragua said, hey, you want these people, which were a whole bunch of mercenaries and people that were being paid by the United States, through whether it be the USAID or the National Endowment of Democracy by the State Department. Nicaragua said, hey, you want them? You can have them. Filled up a plane load and sent them to the United States. Some of them even said, I'm not getting on that plane, because they knew what was waiting for them when they got here too. You know what I'm saying? Because there was, some people there that were really shady. Said they'd rather put their luck in the Nicaraguan prisons than to turn themselves over to U.S. authorities, right?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely correct in that both political parties in the United States have been complicit in that kind of imperialist policy against these countries. And Ben, the last question as we run out of time, the last question, A'Jamal and I talked about this also, is are there any national Chicano Latino organizations that are advocating for a humanistic and progressive immigration policy? What kind of job are the Raza organizations doing in the United States on this issue?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, there's a lot of organizations that are trying to change policy, but because of the reformist character and nature of U.S. immigration policy, it's only kind of piecemeal, and it's not holistic, right? When we talk about it, there is the policy itself is so there's a lot of layers to it. And so when you're talking about everything from changing the registry date, which was the original 1986 immigration IRCA, right? Immigration Reform Act of 1986, they had a registry date that if you were here since in 1970 something, that you can, try to regularize your status. And so a lot of people have been trying to change that registry date to update it to say, okay, well, people that have been here already for the past 30, 40, now going on 40 years, they can actually, change their, adjust their status. And there are different organizations doing a lot of that work. There's some in LA, a lot of, some throughout the entire country. There are national organizations, whether it be Andilan, Chilan, with the UD, and the youth one. Oh my gosh, I'm drawing a blank right now in this particular moment. But are they? I don't necessarily think that they're Chicanos per se. I don't know if they identify that way, right? Because there's a lot of kind of history around the whole question of even being Chicano, right? The whole decade of the Hispanic, the whole 1990s, the slander against raza, against Chicanos, Mexicanos. There's kind of like this almost anti-Mexican sentiment, even coming from some people that, talk about, Mexican hegemony, right? Which is kind of weird, right? Kind of sounding like Trump. But at the end of the day, what we see is that the struggle for and the essence of what Chicanismo is, of self-determination for Mexican Chicanos, raza, people from throughout this continent, right? Is really rooted in this anti-colonial struggle, which is, part of the struggle to say, no, we have to abolish these borders. We have to struggle against these colonial constructs, whether it be the border or whether it be the colonial laws themselves. Because what we have is a normalization of, these police forces, whether it be the Border Patrol, these standing armies, whether it be the Border Patrol or Immigration and Customs Enforcement, are so well financed that any legalized version of any bill will continue to fund these standing armies, that will continue to go after migrant workers, that will continue to criminalize us, that will continue to put us in these concentration camps. So it's kind of like the normalization of an ongoing policy that benefits only corporations and does absolutely nothing to uplift and allow raza workers, migrants in general, to be able to build an economy that serves their interest, to be able to have decent wages, that to have the capacity to reproduce their existence with through their dignified work. Instead, what we have is this constant kind of piecemealing reform that only reproduces the same cycles of oppression. So, unless people take an abolitionist perspective, abolish the border walls, abolish these colonial laws that don't allow people to work, as we all need to work and reproduce our existence, we're going to continue to see, again, the reproduction of a very hostile colonial policies that will continue to oppress us.
All right.
Justice to the question.
All right, well, Ben, we thank you very much, man. I think you enlightened us a lot, and again, especially for the folks in places like Omaha, Nebraska, that are so far from the border, and they have to rely on the quote unquote mainstream media to try to make an understanding and make some meaning of the situation there. So I'm sure this is going to prove very helpful for them. Jamal, do you want to say the last word?
Well, I appreciate it. As chair of the board, we're excited to get our organization much more involved in immigration race issues because, again, we see these folks in this country have lost hope and understanding of people who are struggling and dealing with those issues. So we want to continue to throw out the heavy light. And again, Ben and Patrick, it's always a pleasure to work with you guys and do stuff like this because a lot of times our mainstream media does not share this with our communities. And this is why it's very important to have these wonderful and powerful conversations about immigration and what is happening in our current uh, environment that, again, that stops many people from thriving as they could. So on that note, we'd like to thank you for being here today. We hope you join us again for another edition of Throwing Out Some Heavy Light. May the force be with you. Baroko.